Welcome back to our first workshop session for Liberal Arts Illuminated, Reframing the Narrative, Leadership Towards Inclusive Excellence. I hope you are all well rested and are looking forward to learning a great deal together today. I will make just a few announcements and then we will begin our opening session with Knefelkamp. So just by way of housekeeping items, we won't take a formal break until about 10:45. So feel free to move about the room as you need to. If you look in your conference programs, you'll see there are a couple of moments when we transition from a plenary type speaker to a facilitated discussion to practice in teams. So you can use those sort of natural transition moments, but please feel free to refill your coffee or whatever you need throughout the morning. Sessions are being recorded, so we would like to disseminate what we learn in our conversation as widely as possible after the session. So we just ask that if you are asking a question to please use the microphone. We will make certain to get the microphones to you, but you will and your colleagues will have access to the recordings after the conference. Each of the workshops will have 3 parts. So we will open with a broad conversation or plenary or panel to introduce the big topic idea. So right now we'll start with leadership toward an inclusive curriculum as an example. We will then have a session on models for success, where we hear about how these big ideas can play out on a campus that's done some good movement in this direction. And then we will have time for reflection and action planning with the facilitated practice in team session. And that's when we'll really get to take what we learned from the broadest perspective and put it into action for our campuses. I'd like to take a moment to thank Amit Mrig and Academic Impressions, who provided us with a series of tools to support our action planning. Academic Impressions is one of our partners in planning the conference. For the second time, they've been a great partner to us. And I really encourage you to use the note-taking tools as they serve you. You will see the questions that are guiding the session listed on the first pages. And then they've offered some really thoughtful ways to think about, for example, what's your goal? What are some of the barriers? What are the next steps you need to take? You have a packet of the planning tools for each one of the sessions in your welcome bag. If you need a copy, just let me know and we will make sure you get that. But Amit, I know you're in the room. And if you could just, oh, you're right here in front. So if you could join me in thanking Amit and Academic Impressions for providing this. So before I turn the microphone over to Barb May to formally introduce Lee Knefelkamp, I just want to say I'm excited about challenging ourselves and each other today as we think about the deep and rich history of the liberal arts and the opportunities of inclusion to craft a path together. Last night, Len Pasquarella really challenged us and shared a number of compelling ideas. And there were 3 points that she made that I'd just like to share as we begin this workshop session. The first is, how do we adopt an asset-based perspective through our curriculum and pedagogical practices? So how do we think about an asset-based perspective? How do we avoid the willful disconnect of the liberal arts curriculum from the practical matters of life is a second point that she raised last night. And the third one that really resonated for me, and perhaps a different series of questions resonated for you as it relates to this first session, but how do we think about our curricula and our rewards structure in higher ed in order to facilitate and embrace inclusion? So an asset-based perspective, avoiding the willful disconnect, and how do we think about curricula and our reward structure in order to embrace inclusion? So with those questions and ideas in mind, I now turn it over to Barb May to introduce Lee Knefelkamp and our first workshop session. Thank you.
Welcome to our first workshop, Reframing the Narrative, Leadership Towards an Inclusive Curriculum. My name's Barb May. I'm the Academic Dean at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. I'm speaking today, or up here today, to introduce the overall structure and goals for this particular workshop, as well as to introduce our wonderful speakers and moderator. I look forward to this morning's sessions and the ideas and action items that will be created as a result. This workshop has, as Mary described, has three components. To begin, our plenary speaker, Dr. Knefelkamp, will highlight and introduce the topic for discussion. Second, we'll have an opportunity to learn about how other higher education institutions are addressing this issue from Dr. Buffy Smith. And finally, you will have some time to discuss with your team or with others at your table about potential action steps you might take at your own institutions to address these ideas and issues. This will be led by Dr. Amy Hamlin this morning. This morning, we'll delve into discussions on how to create an inclusive curriculum, both in and out of the classroom. As participants in this workshop, our outcomes we strive to have you reach are the following. We hope and anticipate that you'll be able to, number one, articulate why inclusion needs to be considered in the development and implementation of the curriculum within and outside the classroom. Number two, understand how an inclusive curriculum is developed and elements it may include. Number three, identify and articulate the many curricula within and outside the classroom at play on our many campuses. And finally, identify what steps need to be taken to embed inclusion in your curriculum within and outside the classroom. Therefore, I'd like to introduce our plenary speaker, Dr. Knefelkamp. With a basic Google search or by reading the biography of Lee in the conference material, you know she is well qualified to speak on this topic. Dr. Knefelkamp is a leader in higher education curriculum development, and with her psychology background, also a leader in the holistic development of a student. The intertwining of these two important areas is vital for an inclusive curriculum and an effective learning environment. But I also want to share why we are particularly excited about Lee presenting today. In 2014, St. Ben's and St. John's began playing with the idea of general education reform. Knowing this would require extensive work, likely some resistance from various stakeholders, and include a variety of other potholes, we needed help in initiating the process. We were fortunate at the onset to bring Dr. Knefelkamp back to her Minnesota roots to give a presentation at our fall faculty workshop. She spoke about connecting the dots in education, that an effective learning environment is not simply a course here and there, but courses and experiences in and out of the classroom that help students make connections and help them understand the world around them more holistically. It's a relatively simple concept, but I am not sure if Lee knows what a catalyst it was for our institutions. It provided clarity to a very complex process and allowed our institutions to begin conversations about curriculum reform at a different and much more effective level. And that is why I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Knefelkamp back to campus to help us all clarify a different complex effort to make curricula more inclusive. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Knefelkamp.
Nice small steps for the short people. This is very good. Get myself organized. This is really something. Yeah. Got the clock. Okay. Bill Perry used to say, the mind can absorb only what the fanny can endure. St. Ben's is a pretty special place, and last night it brought me back to my liberal arts McAllister roots. The first was recollections on John Donne, Don't ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for you on the quarter hour. Which led me at about 3 o'clock this morning to contemplate Edgar Allan Poe. Oh, the bells, 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 bells. Then tintinnabulation of the bells. I want to thank St. Ben's for that. And when I take... Whoa, thank you, yes. And when I take my nap this afternoon, I will thank you even more. I'm particularly happy to be home. And St. John's and St. Ben's are very special places for me and have been for a very long time. One of my great research partners, Carol Weidick, with whom I had the pleasure of going to grad school, and we did our dissertations together, was here. And Terry Rhodes, who was at AAC&U, was here, and so it feels like family in terms of coming home. Although you can tell the difference between a place like St. Ben's and McAllister is the Catholics start at 7:30 and the Presbyterians get up at about noon, but it's anyway. Last night, Lynn made an extraordinary, I thought, articulate case, and I've been listening to Lynn for a long time, and I always enjoy it, but it was particularly lovely last night. And I'd like to present to you a few things sort of in accompaniment along with her. And I'd like to talk about illumination. And she talked about it in ways of allowing us to see things, sometimes things we didn't want to see, as you recall, and to see things differently. But I'd like to talk about illumination as an identity construct this morning. That is my background in terms of studying students. And I hope we can hold in our mind, in the examples from today, that a student's interpersonal development, intellectual development, and intercultural development are intrinsically entwined. That we can pull each one of those threads off, and certainly researchers do, and try to drill down and take a look in more fine and refined ways at each one of those, as each one of those strands of the braid. But that what we do in the classroom that facilitates intellectual complexity is not separate, or should not be separate from what we think about when they're thinking about intercultural complexity and the engagement with the other, and should not be separate from what they think about in terms of their own exploration internally of the multiple issues and complexities that are themselves. So I hope we can keep in mind that as a student discovers the multiple perspectives around them, that they will discover that some of those are complementary, some of those are competing, and of course, a really significant issue is many of those are contradictory, or at least they initially feel contradictory. And how do we help people think about how they experience their own views of knowledge of others and of themselves? And I believe it is our responsibility to work with students and with the communities from which those students come to help them think about the illumination within and without, about who they are. I am so concerned about whether or not we are accepting organizational responsibility to really create environments that are not toxic, but in fact are facilitating, when so much of our research shows, with respect to previously underserved students, the environment that we're inviting them to is actually toxic. And that's not a very good swimming pool to be swimming in. It's a little bit like inviting you to swim in the Flint River. It's not a good thing, not a good thing. Okay. So I'd like to illustrate that with a couple of stories, if I may. The first story is actually going to happen on Thursday. After the conference, I will leave here, and in the wonders of modern flight, I will stay at a hotel at the airport. I will then, at 5 o'clock in the morning, fly to Chicago so I can turn around and fly to Sioux Falls. So my sister can pick me up and take me to the horse farm. Our family has owned a farm in Pipestone County, where the great peace pipes are struck, as many of you know, for over 50 years now. And my sister runs it. So here's the story. Every time I come home, my sister brings out a number of horses that haven't been ridden for a while. It's particularly important to her that they have not been ridden for a while. This happens in good weather in the outdoor riding ring, and in bad weather because there's an indoor riding ring. And so the older sister, who used to ride, is put on these horses and put through her paces. And the word goes out as from Caesar Augustus through all the county. And they gather and sit on the hay bales or the straw bales and have coffee and cookies and watch me suffer. This is an annual ritual or a biannual ritual. It's one that I am so looking forward to on Thursday. And what happens is at the end of my riding, it's usually 3 horses, I limp over to where they're having coffee and cookies, and the same question, it's different people now because people have passed, but the same question is asked. The same question is asked. And the question is, how are they treating you out there? Because they know that I am the first person in my family to ever go to college, went to Macalester, and then to get a graduate degree, and then to become a professor, and to work out there, which is the East, okay? Basically Washington, D.C. and New York City. Now, they are enormously proud of this, enormously proud of this. And in fact, my dissertation is famous because the farmhouse slants. You know how they built a new bedroom every time there'd be a new kid. And so one of the rooms slants, so the bed needs something to hold it up, and my dissertation is just the right thickness. And if that isn't the practical use of the liberal arts, I don't know what. Okay, so the question is, how are they treating you out there? And I have to answer, well, don't you know? They're not treating me as good as when I come home, but it's okay. Okay? And then I have crossed the Rubicon back to the tribe. Now I am home. Okay? And that, I think, is an enormously important story for us to think about in terms of the risks that our students take when they come to campus. So many of our students have families that have made sacrifices beyond belief for their children to be able to, or their mothers or their fathers, I mean, we know the age issues are huge here, for their family member to be able to go to school, and yet they are simultaneously facing what we used to call in the Peace Corps a high-risk, high-gain situation. It is a high-risk situation for them, potentially holding out high gain. But often it can be a high-risk and low-gain situation because of the way our campuses are formed and structured, not even intentionally, and that's even the worst part of the sin, unintentionally, in terms of the consequences. So to recognize the very identity risk that it is to be a college student in today's campus, whether it's 2 years, 4 years, public or private, technical or the liberal arts, anything that we want to take a look at, is a risk that simultaneously represents all the hopes of a family, a clan, a group of people that identify with each other, and all the fears of loss. And to live with that simultaneity of the risk and the gain is something I think that we need as people who study college students to pay more attention to. Okay. Story 2. When I was a first-year student at Macalester College, and Macalester had a 414 curriculum, I was in, and they were the first school to have a 414 curriculum. I took an interim course, the January term course, in constitutional law. Thought it was going to be easy. And during the course of those 4 weeks, and I could hardly wait for the spring semester to start. I loved the course, but I could hardly wait for the spring semester to start. We were reading actual Supreme Court decisions. Okay. Plessy versus Ferguson, and then Brown versus the Board of Education. Okay. Loving versus Virginia. I mean, there were these enormously conflicted cases, many of them conflicted in their decisions, and I remember staggering out of class, loving it, but staggering out of it, thinking, how could, this is going to sound so stupid, okay, just bear with me, how could the 9 smartest people in the United States, I know, on a morning like this, how could the 9 smartest people in the United States contradict each other? And even more importantly, more staggeringly, how could sometimes those decisions be complicit in doing direct harm to others or denying good to others? It was a stunning realization. It was a stunning realization. And I began to realize, right, that college was a little more complicated than maybe I thought it was. And now, in my dotage years, I look back and I see the curriculum as a Trojan horse. I thought I was taking constitutional law. They were messing with my mind. And that messing with my mind couldn't just get stopped at the edge of the Supreme Court. It couldn't just stay with any 9 group of people making a decision at any given time. It began to leak everywhere. It began to leak into what do other experts say? What do other experts disagree? How do they justify their way of thinking about things? And I'm not talking the cynical move into, oh, do your own thing, you think what you think, and I'll think what I think, and it doesn't really matter. I'm talking about trying to figure out how people make sense and meaning out of the world, particularly when they seem to do that in contradictory ways. And I couldn't keep it from leaking. I just couldn't keep it from leaking into talking about my friends who were from different religious traditions and talking about students who were from different countries, in being a person who was both from rural Minnesota on the one hand and the child of military officers on the other, a person who did not believe military were baby killers, but also was against the Vietnam War. I couldn't keep it from leaking. The Trojan horse had entered the gates. Right? And we think we're just teaching literature. And we think we're just teaching cross-cultural psychology, but it's leaking all the time. This brings me to think about how much we need to know about student intellectual development, how much it needs to be a part of what it means to be a college professor or a career counselor or a mentor or an advisor or a provost or a president to know the models of what we know about how students come to complexity, about thinking, about themselves, and about others. And we have over 2/3 of a century of work on identity development, racial identity development, other kinds of diversity identity development, but particularly on intellectual identity development, on how students move from what we were talking about last night, the either-or thinking, right? Not the both and, but the either-or, how they move from that dualistic perspective into a perspective that is not only recognizing of, but inviting of diverse and complex perspectives. Not just recognizing that they exist, but inviting them into the conversation. I have a good friend that says you can have 10,000 different learning experiences, or you can have one experience 10,000 times. Right? And we are all in the presence of diversity on our campuses. Whether we are in the engagement of diversity on our campuses seems to me in a very, very different thing. We walk by each other all the time, right, with friendly smiles on our faces. And this dualistic or either-or thinking is, it seems to me, something that is enormously important for us thinking about citizenship. Because the naive dualistic thinker that all of us were, right? And in my version of it, I believed all poetry rhymed. And great poets were people that were so smart that they used words that rhymed in every language. I'll let you scientists think about that one for a minute. Okay. But that naive dualism, right, that brings us for the search for the right answer, that brings us to Rollins or St. Ben's or McAllister or other kinds of places, right? That naive dualism is a structure that is appealed to by the pernicious dualist. Right? And so it is part of our civic responsibility to help students not use the dualistic structure in a pernicious way. And we've seen too much of that over the centuries in our society. But to move from a kind of a naivete and to avoid the perniciousness, to move to an engagement with complexity and with the other in a way that does not villainize the complexity or the other, but in fact seeks it out and embraces it. And this is a fundamental, I think, significant identity issue. So my third story is another true story. And this is the author Nikos Kazantzakis. Some of you may know his work. Zorba the Greek is probably the one that's been the most popular in American culture. He also wrote the Odyssey, a modern sequel with one verse longer than original Odyssey. He had to do them one better. They're just, I don't know, there's just something interesting about that. The Last Temptation of Christ. He's an extraordinary author. I discovered him when I was a sophomore and went to my advisor and asked if I could do an independent study and ordered everything that I could possibly order in English. I didn't read Greek, by Kazantzakis. And now I still have everything that has ever been translated into English by Kazantzakis, and still am on the hunt for everything. Many people associate Kazantzakis with Zorba the Greek, and they associate Zorba the Greek with a sort of a hedonistic thing. Zorba is the hedonistic character, and boss is the young intellectual. Well, in fact, and in truth, Nikos Kazantzakis was from Crete, an island that has been taken over the centuries by many, many cultures. His mother was an intellectual and an artist, a pianist. His father was a Greek freedom fighter and very much impatient with intellectuals. He spent a great deal of time in his younger years exploring issues of his own confused sexuality, by his own description, confused sexuality, and a great deal of time exploring multiple religions and philosophical traditions. He goes to the university where he is a stellar student, but is dissatisfied. He doesn't know who he is. And there's nothing in the curriculum that speaks to him. He's not mirrored in the curriculum. And one of the great things I think that we need to ask at this conference, and every time we begin to sit down to that blank page that becomes ultimately the syllabus, is whose story gets to be told, and who tells the story, and who does the interpretation of the story. Well, he can't find himself in the story, right? Loves being in school, but he can't find himself in the story. And so he goes, his father has left a lignite mine on one of the islands in the Aegean, and he goes with Alexis Zorba. He's Griegos Zorba in the in real life, to spend the summer mining the lignite. Only there isn't any. And if you read the book or you see the wonderful movie, actually the movie is quite a stunning interpretation of the book. He spends the entire time encountering villagers who believe quite differently religiously than he does. He encounters people that have very different views of gender roles, and certainly very different views of sexuality than he might have or experience. He has encountered an anti-intellectualism. Zorba at one time says, why did the young die? Why does anybody die? And he says, I don't know. And Zorba says, well, what's the use of all your goddamn books if they don't tell you that? What do they tell you? And Nikos responds, they tell me of the agony of people who cannot answer questions like yours. So in all this encountering, in this incredible experience, in this incredible set of ongoing conversations, in working with other people who have been, up until this time in his life, quite different from himself, he discovers who he is. He discovers who he is. His father wants him to be a warrior. His mother wants him to be an aesthetic. And at the end of the novel, he says, and this is actually in his own biography, I too can be a warrior, only my soldiers will be the 26 letters of the alphabet. That is what the curriculum can do. That is what integrative learning can do. That is what real encounters can do. That it's not just an intellectual victory, but an identity victory. It's an illumination in ways that are quite startling. He finds then his way in life. He becomes a significant writer. He becomes the United Nations ambassador for peace and for UNESCO. He's nominated for the Nobel Prize, and he lives an enormously successful life, finding a way to integrate what once felt to be not just conflicting, but contradictory aspects of himself. That's what the curriculum can do. So I want to think about how we think about illumination. A number of years ago, Rich Gorecki, who is the retiring president of Wagner College in Staten Island, where my grandson will be a first-year student in the fall, didn't want to go to McAllister. Other than that, a perfectly charming young man. Rich wrote a speech called More Than the View. More Than the View. And if you know Wagner College, it's on the top of the highest hill on Staten Island. And if you stand there on the college and you look out towards New York, you see the entire New York skyline. You see the Statue of Liberty. And of course, you see the boats going up and down. I mean, it's a really working river. And in his speech, he talked about Wagner's history, but it could be our history. We changed some of the groups of people, but it could be any of our history. He talked about the history of working class people, of immigrants, of the kind of people that Wagner was created for. And in his speech, More Than a View, he refused the false dichotomy between learning and working. He refused that false dichotomy because, in fact, he reminded his students and his audience that Wagner was created for both. And it was created by both in order to do that. Out of that speech, the phrase, the practical liberal arts, was born, and some of you who have studied curriculum and are creating your own extraordinary curriculum plans will recognize the phrase, the Wagner Plan, which is a plan that attempts to integrate liberal education, liberal learning, and the practical arts or work. I would suggest to you this morning that part of what our curriculum needs to do, whether it is in the health sciences or what we call the traditional liberal arts or the business school or in the world that I used to live in at Teachers College, Columbia University, the merely applied. They used to talk about 120th as the widest street in New York City. There was Columbia on the one side and then the merely applied on the other side. Okay. I believe our curriculum, I passionately believe our curriculum should illuminate for the students their need to develop and live in that practical liberal arts tradition. That the illumination of refusing the dichotomy between work and the liberal arts, between learning and working, is a false dichotomy, and that within them needs to be the integration across that false dichotomy. Another way of thinking about this, and it's a phrase I leave you, I'm glad you like to connect the dots, I like to connect the dots too, but is about architects and stonemasons. And certainly there's the soaring beauty that we see of great cathedrals. I live only several blocks in Washington, D.C. from the National Cathedral. And it is a place of soaring beauty and magnificent peace at the same time. And the National Cathedral, as you know, is a place for all faiths. So my Jewish whirling dervish sacred circle dance partner teaches there on a weekly basis on the labyrinth that's below the cross on the lower level. One presumes the cross doesn't see the labyrinth and vice versa. But it is a place that welcomes all people. Now, it could not have been built any of the great cathedrals in the world, Angkor Wat, any of the great places in the world could not have been built without a combination of architects who had soaring visions and stonemasons who could enact them, and in fact had visions themselves. You can't go all the way up to see what I'm about to describe. You can get about 3/4 of the way up now. But the stonemasons carved cherubs and animals and motifs at the very, very all over the building, but at the very, very top of the building where no one would ever see them. And they carved into those motifs the faces of their grandchildren, faces of their grandparents, faces of their ancestors, faces of their dearest loved ones, because they knew, out of the integration of the soaring vision and the practical operation, they needed to represent who they were. And whether people would ever climb to the very top, and you can't, okay? Or if you're like me, you don't want to, they knew what had been carved there. They knew what the curriculum was. What we need to help our students be able to understand, to feel, and to do, it seems to me, is to realize that they are building cathedrals of their own lives. They are both the architects and the stonemasons. And that the false dichotomies that are perniciously around them will only get in their way of achieving their vision. And this should be a part of the message of our curriculum, as surely as anything else is on our syllabus. This will allow them to translate illumination of the liberal arts into what Katie Cannon, the first African-American graduate of Union Theological Seminary, called discernment. Enlightenment and illumination equal discernment in Katie's mind. And she said, for each generation is called to discern the moral obligations and the moral situations of their time. And in that discernment, in that vision, in that architecture, is also called for them to find ways to act, for them to be the stonemasons that can make the vision real. This, I believe, is what the curriculum is really about, that we need to help instill this in our students. And in order to do that, we need to create environments that are safe for them to face the false dichotomies that are in the world around them, and particularly in the public discourse today, and to really see that the curriculum is about those hidden gargoyles up there, and really is about themselves. Thank you very much.